Recording.
Good afternoon, readers. Welcome to Tilly's Shelf. Today I am finally going to talk to you about this book, A Note in Music by Rosamond Lehmann from 1930. I finished this book a couple of weeks ago, but it's taken me a while to gather my thoughts on it because I found it simultaneously a very easy and very difficult book, both to read and to review. So what do I mean by that? Well, this book is easy to read in that Lehmann has this beautiful clarity of style. If you know the phrase, "good prose is like a window pane" from George Orwell's 1946 essay Why I Write, that immediately springs to mind for me with this book. And that's about the author being able to present their views without intruding on it. And although some people have argued that this book is semi-autobiographical, to me that's not really the case, and we get a real window into the inner lives of the 7 core characters of the book without there being too much of the opinion of the author present. But it was difficult to read as well because it is not a simple happy tale. All I can say is that if you ever struggle with melancholy, existential angst and ennui, this might not be the book for you, because it portrays these feelings with a breathtaking accuracy. The lead protagonist, Grace Fairfax, is a southerner stuck in a bleak northern town. She feels out of place, she feels isolated. At the beginning of the book she is recovering from a minor illness that nevertheless really affects her emotionally, and it seems to be quite a common feature of her life to be ill and unhappy in this northern town. And for myself, again as a southerner living in the north, again as somebody, I was ill when I started reading this book. Aside from the fact that Grace is married, older than me, and different, very different in her personality and in the features of her life. She is a 1930s housewife, and I am not. She was almost too familiar, and that was hard to read at times. We read to learn about other people's lives, but I felt like I had almost a glimpse of my own. This could be you in 10 years' time. And I doubt I would be the only person who had that response to Grace. She's a very knowable character. Analysing and interpreting this book was again easy and hard. There are just so many themes and feelings to discuss. This book is ripe for analysis and it is deceptively detailed. When I first finished reading it, I started a mind map to get an idea of all of the themes, because I could tell already that there were so many, and to gather my thoughts together. And what happened was the mind map just got busier and busier and my thoughts got more and more confused, and I barely scratched the surface, and this video I guarantee will barely scratch the surface of what you could say about this book. I think I wouldn't be surprised to hear that people have studied it in literature courses and so on, because there is that level of potential in there, and I think on rereading this book would reveal a whole lot more. So what are these themes then? I've mentioned north and south, the passage of the seasons and of the stages of life. There's also a lot of nature in this book, countryside nature and city nature. In fact, it reminds me of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell in that it has this presentation of the south as the home of like cosy nature and summer sunshine, whereas the north is the home of winter and industry and illness. If you know much about England, if you live here or have visited here, you'll know that that isn't strictly fair as a representation of North and South, but in a literary sense it does seem to work for certain books. Aside from those themes, this book is also about human relationships, not so much loving relationships as marriages, friendships, affections and infatuations, and social awkwardness, and also how to avoid relating to people as well. The characters are very self-absorbed, like all humans. Each of them has their own powerful emotions which we share when the narrative comes from them, but every now and then they get this flash of realisation that other characters have this inner emotional self as well. When her servant bursts into tears in front of her, Grace Fairfax is left thinking, was it possible? Even Annie? And she's almost shocked at how the experience of empathy and shared grief overwhelms her. She's frightened of her own pain, of the slipping of control. And in turn, Grace, who sees Annie as this stable, unshakable, almost emotionless servant character, is seen by Nora, her friend, as unsusceptible old Grace. So we get the sense of their emotional lives and their emotional pictures of each other never quite tying up, and that happens again and again in different places. It deals a lot with female sexuality, but in such a subtle way that I didn't really realise it until I'd finished this book, and I was looking at this kind of Venus de Milo figure on the cover and wondering what it had to do with the story. So This is a Virago Modern Classics edition from 1988. It's from a charity shop, and the picture on the front is Homage to Roger Fry by Mark Gertler. And at first I couldn't really work out what this nude torso had to do with a book that is very restrained and doesn't really involve much nudity. And then I realised that despite that, this book has bastard children, it has divorce, it has extramarital sex, it has prostitution, but it deals with them all in a way that is discreet but also very frank. It looks at both sides of the matter. We have characters who view sex as an abscess and characters who are filled with ripeness waiting to be plucked. In addition to that, of the 4 male characters we have in this novel that we get into the headspace of, there are 2 of them that speak or rather think very openly about their feelings for another character, Oliver, who never actually appears in the book, in a way that we could see this as a kind of intense friendship, but we know that it is more than that. This book makes a quiet argument for greater openness about sexuality and life in general. It dismisses the stiff upper lip and lets the characters really cry and shout and suffer, but it maintains a kind of dignity to that as well. In my last video I talked about Agatha Christie and a Miss Marple book, and when I think about the fact that this book came out in the same year as the first Miss Marple book, and also in the same year that some paintings by D.H. Lawrence, I believe, were confiscated for having nudity, for being on display with nudity, I am astounded by the modernity of the book and the way that it deals with these themes as though they are just part of normal life, which of course they are. In comparison to Miss Marple, where these themes are viewed as very improper, and if they appear, they're kind of like, they appear as a motive for murder and they appear as something very dark and a little bit dangerous. This book is radical. This book puts forward an argument that, you know, these things are okay, but also that there are other aspects of life that are accepted that are not okay. It almost argues against marriage in a gentle way. So this is all part of why the book is very hard to analyse. There very little happens on the surface level. I'll talk about what does happen in a bit, but so much happens on the substrata, and it's all big themes, like we've said, relationships, but also life and death, and themes that you can't really talk about in a short summary review and be eloquent and not exaggerated and melodramatic about, in a way that this book is not melodramatic at all. It's very graceful, it's very discreet, restrained, thoughtful. And that is why I have 10 pages worth of notes on this book, all working towards doing this video, and I'm still struggling to produce an overarching interpretation of the story. I guess overall, to me, this book is about the inexplicable ups and downs of life. None of the characters really get what they want, but by the end of the book we see them as somehow content. They have overcome some inexpressible emotional climax and they're safe on the other side, even if that safety is an illusion. In the last chapter, a kitten comes into Grace's kitchen to shelter from the storm, and it's bedraggled and it's sad, and it just sits there and drinks milk and gradually begins to purr, and we get the feeling that this kitten is like our characters, trying to forget about the cold and the storm outside and trying to make the most of the warmth of the final moment that they're in. In terms of style, I'd say this book is on the cusp of being a stream of consciousness. Parts of it definitely have that stream of consciousness feel, but other parts are more traditional in style. It does remind me of Virginia Woolf, in particular to the Lighthouse, because like to the Lighthouse it has an interesting handling of time and the way that time moves forward, and there is this summer day where everything about life seems almost as perfect as it can be. It's filled with the unifying element of laughter, and then we get whisked away from that moment, just as we do in To the Lighthouse as well, and into a dreamlike world, and then out on the other side of that to life in all its prosaic and grim normality. One of the focuses of the book is that tricky period that is after the end of youth and before the start of middle age, which is almost a period of stagnation. Grace thinks, quite near the beginning, that she is embedded thick and flat now in her life. Nothing mattered. Nothing would ever happen for her again. And she thinks this while she's putting in a hairpin, and there's this great image of her as essentially being the hairpin. stuck there in her life, holding things together and just continuing straight on towards a point. And it's about coming to terms with that stagnation, that nothingness, that idea that life will not be what you hoped for or expected. For example, Tom has this little story that he tells new acquaintances about why he had to renounce going to Oxford and with it somehow his rightful social status. So he has this little explanation of why his life isn't what he intended it to be and what it ought to have been if the great upheavals of the start of the 20th century had not occurred. We get the feeling that these characters would have had very different lives if the First World War had not occurred. It definitely casts a shadow through the book, as in many books written in the 20s and 30s. These characters certainly have regrets. They have gripes with the world, they have doubts, even as at the same time they just keep plodding on and dealing with each day as it comes. As one of the characters, Nora, says near the end of the book, life left no room for crises. But there is also some positivity here. We see an older character, Mary Seddon, Nora's aunt, as being quite content with her life and her experiences and even the things that other people might consider to be mistakes. And the book ends with a character called Hugh setting out on a boat on what is to be the last journey of his youth. And he thinks, well, there was always a time of loneliness, depression, after the first excitement of the start, the bustle of departure. If we think of the excitement of the start as being youth, our characters have lived through that and they all have quite lively accounts of the things that happened during their youths, and the loneliness as well is almost the period that is encapsulated by this book. And we get the feeling that now they do need to go and establish these new connections to last for the rest of the journey, and the final chapter is full of that. It's full of the various characters establishing new connections and new plans and new approaches for dealing with the coming period of their lives. So as I mentioned, there are 7 core characters in this book and the narrative moves between their minds at various points. A couple of others get a little look in as well, but there are 7 principal people. Most of these characters form neat pairs. There is Grace Fairfax and her husband Tom, who have this childless, monotonous life. Then there is Grace's friend Nora, who is married to Gerald and has 2 children with him, and their marriage is full of little jealous spats, really. There's a lot in this book about how a marriage works after 10 years and how it can be maintained and almost the cost of marriage. Grace and Tom and Nora and Gerald's lives are interrupted by the arrival of another pairing of characters, Hugh Miller and his sister Claire, who has separated from her husband and taken that step of restoring her independence. And these are the youthful characters. My book has an introduction, a very interesting introduction by Janet Watts from 1981, and she describes Hugh and Claire as being like a bright butterfly on a damp clump of weeds. And I think that's a very apt description of the pair of them and what they mean to other characters in the book. They come from the south, but they also come from the outside world, and they bring with them opportunity, freedom and spontaneity, and they mean something different but always positive to every other character in the book, even though they themselves, especially Hugh, still have this inner turmoil. So we've got this idea again of being self-absorbed, so these characters are seen as idyllic and having a wonderful life, even though they also feel that they struggle with a lot of things and they almost envy the characters that they meet, as well as pitying them. The final character, who is unpaired, is Pansy, and she stands on her own, and to me the character of Pansy represents life itself in a way. She's one of the ways in which life is represented, because she is this exquisite consumptive prostitute, and she combines the features of life, beauty and decay. She is described as having a face unreal in its delicacy, its glow and its look of wasting. And of course, with her name and other things, she is linked directly to nature, which is also shown as being simultaneously beautiful and decaying. So as I've said, we start with these characters in a northern town. Hugh and Claire arrive, they spend a day in the summer sunshine, and then Grace somehow manages to escape and she goes on holiday to this unknown location in the south, and it's almost like a timeless period there. And she has a kind of epiphany, but it does not cure her. It doesn't stop her from being pursued by death and dissatisfaction for the rest of the book, essentially. And then Hugh and Claire move on, and the equilibrium from the start is gradually restored. And the book ends with Hugh on this boat, and he says it was time to start enjoying the journey. And really, that's one of the messages of this book. Youth is over, the summer is over, but you have to just plunge into life and keep going. The story takes place over the course of a year, but it also takes in the full lifetimes of the characters. Each of them draws from key moments and turning points in their past to understand the present and the events of the book. And we get the feeling that this moment, or the moments that develop during the story, will become as important to them in the future, that they will look back on this as a vital period of their lives. And I think that is what is meant by the title, A Note in Music, which comes from this quote from W.S. Landor. But the present, like a note in music, is nothing but as it appertains to what is past and what is to come. I think really what this means is that a single musical note out of context doesn't mean anything or stir any emotion in us. That musical note can only be understood as one fraction of a melody, the melody that comes before and after it, just like these moments in the lives of our characters can only be understood as one part of their lifetime. So it is a very fitting title. The first line of A Note in Music exploits that in that it is in the past continuous tense. She was dressing for dinner, and that has no emotional impact really, but it throws us into this ongoing, developing, incomplete action. We are immediately immersed in the moment, like being halfway through a musical bar, and the emotional import of that moment only becomes apparent as we get further into the book. This book is divided into 7 parts rather than chapters, and only 2 of these parts are chronologically connected. The others are separated by various periods up to several months. They are like different movements in the musical piece, and at first the movements join together quite gracefully, so the year slid imperceptibly from the first to the second month of its course. And then they introduce themselves with vigour. Part 3 begins, "Now it was the middle of May," and that is quite a delightful sentence, and it captures the joy of the characters who have been waiting for summer to arrive. Towards the end of the book, all of this changes and we get blank statements. The end of September, the end of November. The brief summer is over and there is no reason to be optimistic about what these next seasons will bring. After each of these introductory sentences, the parts all begin with quite a vivid description of the season, either what it is like or what in an ideal world it should be like, and that ideal world is often the South. And that sets the mood for the ensuing part of the book and helps to extract us from the moment we have just experienced in the last part and move us on into the present moment that we are about to witness. And the fact that this book is set over the course of a year gives it quite a cyclical feeling. And there are actually things that happen in the first chapters, both for Nora and Gerald and Tom and Grace, that happen again almost precisely repeated in the last chapter. So Nora arrives home late, the slightly neglectful mother, to find her son's coats discarded on the floor, her husband in a bit of a mood, and the smell of onions invading the house. And Grace is cold and ill again, and Tom warms her in an embrace that is described as the habit of years both times that it occurs. And there's a very deliberate element to that showing of the restoration of equilibrium and the continuance of these moments. These are the moments that will continue to go for the rest of their lives. Cat. Despite its startling maturity, Lehmann wrote this book when she was only 29 years old. It was her second novel in a string of very beautiful and very real stories about normal people dealing with normal events. Lehmann is one of the few authors that I would actually claim as a favourite. I haven't read everything by her yet, but every book that I have read has been an absolute delight to read and just a real gem. There is so much more to say about A Note in Music, but I don't feel like I can really say it anymore without obscenely obsessive rambling. So if you have read it or if you want to read it, get back to me in the comments about what you think of it, about what you think of its themes, and whether you think that I've been excessive in my praise of it, because to me this book is just a couple of clumsy phrases and overblown passages away from being a perfect example of a 1920s, 1930s novel. But I can believe that other people would disagree. I know that reviews at the time were not that fond of it. It astonishes me that Rosamond Lehmann seems to be quite a little known author. I couldn't actually find many booktube reviews of any of her books. I don't know whether they're just hidden inside wrap-ups or something, but I was surprised. So if you do read it, come back, talk to me about it. I think I will be mulling over this book for quite a while, and I would like to be able to talk about it more, definitely. Meanwhile, I have just finished the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, and I will be coming back to you with a lighter-hearted, presumably, review of this book. Until then, happy reading. I'm just gonna sit here and chill with my cat. I don't know if you can actually see her. This might go quite wrong. Oh, kitty. She's not very happy with this. Come on. This is Luna, and she's got me absolutely covered in hair. That's not very dignified. That's obscene.